that's why we've landed, and we're here to warn you, as we've warned civilizations on other worlds, that you face going in two directions. One is complete extermination very quickly if you embark on a third world war, or you can go into outer space and advance very quickly. But if you do the latter, then it has to be on our terms, and we will not allow warlike races to leave the confines of their own world. And if you don't change your ways, but you still decide to leave the planet, then we may be forced to do something about that to prevent you going further into space. So those were the messages. It was, we want to help you, we want to do what's right, but you've got to do something to curb your warlike ways. And those were the central themes throughout most of the contactee books, lecturers, authors, researchers, and experiences. So, it's one of these things where that theme, to an extent, did go away when the abductions started. Now, what's interesting is that in abductions, although you don't have the deep concerns about the aliens expressing their concerns about nuclear war, many abductees have spoken about when they've been on board UFOs, they've suddenly seen in their minds images of things like the collapse of the polar ice caps or the ozone layer or the rainforests being destroyed. So in other words, even the bug-eyed little grey guys seem to be warning us about our future, that the threat of nuclear war has gone from the message, and now it's like ecological destruction and pollution and that sort of thing.
So it's really changed.
Well, it's changed in terms of what the problem is, but like the warning to the human race about certain things that we're doing to ourselves and the planet is still there.
Well, that's because we're stupid.
That could have something to do with it.
Why these people? Why not somebody with more credibility? Why not go visit J. Edgar Hoover or somebody?
Yeah, that's again another point, I bring up as to a lot of these people, they weren't anybody significant. In fact, a lot of them didn't even have any background in the UFO subject. They were literally just chosen. It'd be kind of the case that somebody would be driving home late one night, they'd see this light come down on the side of the desert road. They were curious, they'd go over, and they were literally picked. You will go out and spread the word. And it was almost as if these people were hypnotized in some ways and felt, their mind was changed overnight, where they were put on this path. They felt galvanized to do it. This would be their life from now on. But in terms of why such people were chosen at random, I think that's one of the important points, that it was at random. I think there is good evidence, as I kind of alluded to earlier, that government agencies weren't just interested in chasing down UFO sightings and encounters with radar and aircraft. They were actually trying to catch some of these beings and these people. And I think that these entities were trying to avoid the government having any sort of recognized way of following them. In other words, these aliens weren't following an established path of going from this city then onto that city and meeting specific people. By keeping it entirely at random, it prevented the government from having a good handle on how they were working and what they were doing. And I think that's the reason. These aliens were probably concerned that if they had too much of a pattern to their actions, that they were going to get caught. Keeping it at random allowed them to remain one step ahead of the government, and picking people at random, was an even better way of doing that as well.
It just doesn't seem a very effective way to get your message out.
Well, and maybe that's why the whole issue of the contactee phenomenon died away, because other than for a few years when people like George Van Tassel was putting on these huge conferences, it wasn't a movement that took off on a massive scale. It was something that it certainly did have a following. I mean, George Adamski's first book, Flying Saucers Have Landed, in its first printing sold 125,000 copies. So there was this brief period from about 53 to about 58 when the contactee movement was a significant movement. But unfortunately, what it didn't do was break out of its moorings, if you like, and spread further into mainstream society. So maybe that's why you know, the aliens discarded that approach for the most part, and then the abduction thing came into play. You know, perhaps it failed, and they saw that it failed.
They didn't have the internet.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
They were still working on dial-up, probably, I guess.
I mean,
No,
I was just thinking of like Jesus Christ Superstar, you know, in the movie. It's like, well, why'd you come now? We didn't have mass communication. It's like the 50s wasn't a whole lot better.
Well, you know,
I guess they
one
had
of
television.
one of the possibly intriguing areas that's been put forward is the idea that perhaps these aliens, you know, we consider them to be all powerful and far in advance of us. It may well have been the case that the aliens that the contactees met weren't more than, you know, say 100 years ahead of us in terms of technology, and perhaps their presence here was quite limited. You know, maybe they had like one mothership and 5 or 6 scout craft that they were flying around the Earth and landing. You know, we imagine that they had this huge resource behind them, but if they really were, you know, not too far in front of us, perhaps they were quite limited in their actions on the Earth. You know, they tried to portray themselves as having this huge presence, but maybe they weren't. You know, perhaps they were literally the equivalent of, you know, an aircraft carrier and a few aircraft traveling to the North Pole and making flights back and forth, and they didn't have much more than that. You know, I think that's a possibility.
Well, there's been a new theory that has come out about UFOs, is the whole idea of like the USOs, and that there's a whole society and culture of people that are living underground, and that some of the UFO stuff or USO stuff is actually these people that are actually Earthlings or people who have been living underground for thousands of years.
Well, that's an interesting theory. I mean, one of the people I interviewed for the book was a good friend of mine who unfortunately died last year, Mac Tonis. And Mac had a book out last year called The Crypto-Terrestrials. And that's the specific theory that Mac was following that he spoke about when I interviewed him for the book, the idea that perhaps thousands of years ago there were highly advanced cultures on the Earth, perhaps in some ways more advanced than we are today in terms of certain technologies. And that as we, the human race, kind of infested the planet more and more, they decided to, you know, stay away from us and moved underground in some deeper caverns and literally under the oceans. And again, it's a controversial theory, but Mac's book actually presented a lot of intriguing data in support of the idea that some UFOs might be evidence of an ancient Earth-based civilization that was kind of related to the human race, but were not Homo sapien. And that they passed themselves off as extraterrestrials to move amongst us, so we'll never really understand their real point of origin. In other words, they were camouflaging who they were with these fake stories of aliens. And you know, it's a controversial theory, but I mean, in terms of investigating it, I think it's a worthwhile angle to look into.
I think it's a kind of interesting angle if you start bringing in things like Atlantis and the flood, or there are the theories that, you know, we had at one point in time nuclear weapons and we bombed ourselves out of existence, and maybe these people went into, you know, these underground shelters, kind of like the Time Machine, and there were the, you know, the Mogs or whoever they were that lived all underground. You know, that might have been our past.
Yeah, I mean,
it's possible.
If you look back in all ancient cultures, their myths and legends, you know, you have stories about the gods coming from the skies and flying chariots and catastrophes like floods and, you know, the earth rising up and earthquakes. And you have to wonder if they are actually talking about, I guess, almost like cultural legends and folk tales that are actually distortions of a very ancient nuclear war. You know, if we're talking about something 40, 50,000 years ago, and, you know, today there's obviously no or very little left of it in terms of actual physical evidence, if anything at all. All we might have would be legends and stories passed down orally through the generations, which would then get distorted, but would be left with this sort of central motif of that once there were highly advanced cultures and that they suddenly vanished overnight almost. But, you know, if they did go underground or into the oceans, that would be sort of a viable scenario as to why they were able to hide from us and survive, and it may also explain, elements. I won't say the whole UFO phenomenon, but it might explain certain elements